Seattle, 1941. The city looked nothing like it does today. No tech boom, no stadiums, no crazy skyscrapers. This was a city defined by taverns, brothels, and industrialization. The Emporium's history roots back to a man by the name of Clarence J. Danny Danzel, who came out west to seek better opportunities and set up shop in Seattle's Skid Row. Danny was born in 1911 in St. Paul, Minnesota. In 1929, Danny moves to Detroit to learn to tattoo from Percy Waters, one of the most well-known tattooers in the country. Danny started moving through Colorado and then on to Portland before finally landing in Seattle. Still seen as taboo, tattooing was far from welcomed in any of these places. Landlords refused to rent to artists, and they were forced to take up small sections in taverns and brothels. This is the early workings of American tattooing. In 1943, Danny joined the U.S. Navy and served on a PT boat in the Pacific. Even then, he kept tattooing, doing whatever he could to stay connected to his craft. After World War II, Danny returns to tattooing in Seattle with a name, Seattle Tattoo. The 1950s felt like the beginning of the end for American tattooing. After World War II and the Korean War, demand for tattoos fell off due to a limited number of GIs being shipped off to war. As a result, shops closed. And in most cities away from a military base, there wasn't much tattooing to be had. But Danny stayed open, one of only a few in the entire country still at it. He worked as a chef on tugboats across the city to maintain his passion for tattooing full-time. Even my father, a veteran of this time period, who was covered in tattoos, thought this was the end of tattooing. A new name entered the picture, Zeke Owen, a wild character. After Zeke got into a drunken brawl with two cops in San Diego, it was time to skip town in order to avoid prosecution. Zeke fled to Seattle and opened Trade Winds Tattoo in 1960. Zeke took sterilization seriously, largely in part because his wife was a nurse, and that influence carried into how he ran the shop. At the time, very few tattooers were thinking about things like gloves or hygiene. Zeke's practices stood ahead of his time. For a brief period, legendary Ed Hardy, who tattooed under the name Ed Talbot for his early years, worked out a Trade Winds Tattoo with Zeke. They became good friends, but Hardy found Seattle too rough and gritty. He moved to Hawaii to work with Sailor Jerry. This was a time where the future in tattooing brushed shoulders with the Pacific Northwest. But before Ed's departure, Zeke got introduced to Sailor Jerry, and that's when things really started to come together. The Emporium is born. In 1964, Zeke was ready for a change and left town, headed for Guam, where he opened a tattoo shop, bar, and brothel. Danny and Zeke became good friends. Danny bought Trade Winds, renaming it the Seattle Tattoo Emporium. It wasn't just a rebrand. The name Emporium was intentional. It meant the shop could handle any kind of work, no matter the style or client. This became the first recorded address to mark the shop's legacy, 1303 First Avenue, right in the heart of Seattle's Skid Row. Heading towards the late 60s and 70s, things started to shift. Tattooing was traditionally seen as a patriotic way for the military men to express themselves before heading off to war. The hippie movement, Vietnam protests, and counterculture opened the doors to a new kind of client. Tattoos became a form of self-expression, not just a symbol of service. It was around this time that a woman named Beverly Bean walked into the Emporium. She called herself Madame Lasanga, after a comic book villain. She had a tough-as-nails personality and asked Danny for an apprenticeship. He took her on. Danny leaned into the showmanship and Lasanga's fame. She received awards at national tattoo conventions as the world's youngest female tattoo artist and one of the most beautifully tattooed women. And he advertised her as much as possible on the shop windows. It worked, and it made her a legend in her own right. The Emporium attracted serious talent. Artists like Don Nolan, Kevin Brady, Pete Stevens, and Tom Yeoman came through. Even Horiyoshi III, the iconic Japanese tattooer, visited the Emporium during a national convention. With it being his first American tattoo parlor, he was so impressed with the work of P.A. Stevens that he gifted him his own personal portfolio. In the early 80s, underground comic artist Greg Irons joined the team. Given his background, Irons applied his knowledge of negative space into tattooing to redefine what a finished tattoo looked like. Sadly, on November 14, 1984, Greg was hit by a bus and killed in Bangkok just days after getting a good luck tattoo from a monk. That same year, the shop moved to 1106 Pike Street. Danny had retired by this point, but still walked into the shop every day. The shop kept its old school charm. There was a piranha tank under a sign that said free tattoo removal. Circus banners on the walls. It was part sideshow, part tattoo parlor. Pete Stevens was employed at the time and constantly fought with Danny over this old school way of running the shop. On Christmas Eve, 1986, Danny passed away after more than 40 years in the business. The shop entered a new period of modernization, tearing down the outdated circus charade of past times. The shop continued on, and names like Sailor Cam, Mike Malone, Terry Tweed, Dave Shore, and others passed through the Emporium at this period. In 1989, I, James Hillary, entered the picture, better known as Jimmy the Saint. I'd apprenticed under Dennis Dwyer in Arizona and came to Seattle just as Fleet Week was kicking off. Pete became a second mentor to me as I continued to refine my skills. Leading into the 90s, there was a great surge in tattooing across the globe. Grunge, punk, and Seattle's entire culture exploded, and the Emporium was right in the middle of it. All things were happening at the shop, becoming a hub for screen printing band shirts for Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains, the Supersonics, Mariners, punk rockers, military, and all began to come through the doors of the Seattle Tattoo Emporium, exposing tattooing to demographics that would have otherwise never even considered getting tattooed. In 1997, the shop's building shut down for renovations. The shop moved temporarily to 1110 East Pike, which later became our neighbors at Super Genius Tattoo. By 1999, the Emporium relocated again, this time to 1508 Bourne Avenue, the former Apple Theater, which had been Seattle's last porn theater. Thanks to Seattle's Community Roots program, the shop was able to stay in the neighborhood with help from rent control for small businesses. This is the current location for the shop still to this day. In 2017, my wife, Romy, known as Boss Lady, and myself officially took over the shop. The Emporium needed serious work. Arguably, it would have been easier to start over from scratch. Together, we restored it, ushering in a new life for this shop. Owning the Emporium wasn't just about running a business. It was about preserving something important. One of the oldest still operating tattoo shops in the US. The goal now is to protect that history and share it, not just through tattoos, but through the legacy of rich tattoo history born out of the Pacific Northwest.